Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our first session for this week, which is part 1 of Understanding HDMI 2.1. This is Frederick from Sound United, and I am joining you all this evening from Hong Kong. We would like to thank our partners across South Asia for promoting this event, because we have, again, 400 plus participants tonight crossing all states in India. Pakistan, the Arab Emirates, the Gulf states, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Jordan. So quite a big group. Joining us as well tonight are my colleagues Jim from Minnesota and Jen in San Diego, California. Our host tonight is Phil Jones, joining us from his lovely home in San Diego, where it is currently 8 a.m. in the morning. Over to you, Phil.
So, good morning, or for you, good evening. Thank you again for coming to my home and spending some time with me. So today we're going to be talking about HDMI and the newest format. Now, we're going to be talking a lot of numbers, and I know you're going to have a lot of questions. So feel free to put them in the chat. I want to remind you that this is actually a two-part session. So today we want to give you the foundation about how the technology works before we talk about specific products. Because I know a lot of you are going to be asking about your current AVR, the upcoming AVR, how do I make this adjustment in a current Marantz AVR? We get that. That is going to be covered more in the second session. We just want you to understand why you're going to be making those settings and why you're going to be making those adjustments by giving you a foundation today, okay? So please keep that in mind. So to introduce myself again, I am the Director of Training for all of our Sound United's brands, Denon, Marantz, Class A, Definitive, Polk Audio, and Boston Acoustics. And Jen and Jim are are part of my team and actually keep me in line and make sure that I stay focused on what I should be talking about. So so we're going to go through this, and hopefully you will have a good foundation about this technology as we go along. And I still want to stress, if you the next session is about how to get the most out of 2.1 with upcoming new products that are coming and existing AV products. So if you really want to dive into that, make sure that you tune in tomorrow, or you also watch the video tomorrow. If you look at part 1 and part 2, hopefully you will have a very strong foundation going through this year and the next when we come to talking about different video technologies. Okay, so let's continue on. So there's another new HDMI standard, another one. And the reason for that is to provide better video, better audio, enhanced gaming, and a better user experience. So today we're going to talk pretty much about the better video more than anything. Tomorrow we will really tackle the better audio, the enhanced gaming, and the better user experience. But I really want to talk about the video side of it, because the video enhancements are what really required a new format because of the increased amount of bandwidth, the amount of data that you have to send from your display to, from your TV to, from your source to your display. So in order to talk about this, we have to understand how video works. And there's basically 5 basic elements of video: resolution, frame rate, color depth, brightness range, and color space. So let's talk about each one of these individually. Because the 3 that increase the amount of size when it comes to video is color depth, resolution, and frame rate. So those 3, whenever I increase any of those 3, the file size gets bigger. So you end up, if you were someone who is downloading a video, you go from maybe 300 meg to 1 gig by increasing these files pretty quickly. So let's go through each one of these one at a time. So the first thing, resolution. Think of video is basically a bunch of still photographs shown in rapid succession, one after the other, really quickly. Anybody that has a digital camera knows that a 16 megapixel image is a larger file than an 8 megapixel image. So when we went from, so basically HD is a 2 megapixel photograph, each frame. 4K is an 8.2 megapixel image, and 8K is a 33 megapixel image. So if I go from each frame of a 8K signal, 8K video is 16 times more pixels than that of an HD frame. So of course, the file size is going to get dramatically bigger. Moving on from that, like I said, video is just a bunch of photography or photos shown rapidly. If the more photos I show in a second, or the more photos the more photos I will show throughout the video, which means the file gets bigger. So if I go from 24 frames per second to 120 frames per second, I am showing 5 times more images in that video throughout the movie. So 5 times more images at much larger resolutions means that's why your video files are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that adds a load to your HDMI systems, which is why sometimes you will have installed an HDMI system, HDMI from a receiver to a TV or from a receiver to a projector, and it worked perfectly fine in HD. And then all of a sudden, when I went to 4K, it didn't work. It didn't work anymore. The last thing is what is called color depth. Most times we don't talk about this, or we don't promote it as much as we should. This has a huge impact on what you see. Color depth is how many numbers do I have to describe colors. So for example, older Blu-rays, HD material is 8-bit color, which means you have 16 million numbers that I could use to describe a color. We're not really going to get into bit depth, but basically 8 bits equates to 256 red, 256 blue, and 256 green. If you multiply 256 by 256 by 256, you end up with 16 million options you could choose from. Sounds like a lot, but that's not enough colors to really display the real world. So if I look at a sky, there's a huge amount of gradation in a sunset. And if you don't have enough colors, you end up with what's called banding. There's hard lines as it's trying to jump from one color shade to another. So the more numbers I have to define a color, the shades of a color, the smoother and more realistic the colors become. We're not adding more. Well, I guess we're not. We'll talk about that. The next one is about, are we making? Can we display colors that cannot be reproduced before? Not really. We're just giving you more numbers to describe the colors the TV is capable of producing. So if you go to 10-bit, you go to 1 billion colors. And if you go to 12-bit, you go to 68 billion colors. So just by adding 2 more bits of data, that's per frame, you end up with this massive leap in color resolution. But those 2 bits mean a lot more data has to be transported. So more color depth, more resolution, and more frames means the file size is going to get bigger. A few years ago, we introduced HDR. And people always ask me, what about HDR? Does that make the file size bigger? HDR actually enhances color space and brightness range. It does not make the file any bigger. I could have a 4K SDR file, standard dynamic range file, and a 4K HDR file, and the file size, if I use the same frame rate, resolution, and bit depth, is going to be the same size. The only difference is how I tell the TV to utilize the information. So the first thing, HDR. HDR increases the color space. What this is I have all those numbers, 8-bit or 10-bit, to describe points on a triangle. The difference between HDR and SDR is how big of a triangle can I use to describe that particular group of colors. So the triangle of colors that I can describe is larger than what it was when you're looking at the older HD content. So think of it this way: the red of a London bus is outside the color range of a standard HD Blu-ray. It's a color that is outside of the triangle that can be used to describe the colors on a Blu-ray. So you could never describe that color. Now the color of a London school bus, a red stop sign in the US, is in the range of the new triangle. So now I can tell the TV that is the exact color I want. And if the TV has the capability of reaching that color, of reproducing that entire triangle, I can actually see it. So colors are a lot more vibrant. The next thing that it increases is what's called the brightness range. And that is how much brightness can I use to describe a scene. For basically from the dark area to the very, very bright area. Originally, it's measured in what's called nits. I'm sure you probably heard of it if you looked at TVs. So before, standard HD content or even 4K standard dynamic range content, you can describe brightnesses from 0 to 100 nits is the measurement that they use. Now, with HDR, I can describe colors from 0 up to 10,000 nits, which is 100 times more colors than what I could have done before, which means I can describe Ferrari in the sunlight and Ferrari in the shadows much, much better. So you end up with more details in the dark areas and more detail in the bright areas. That does not make the file size bigger. It just says you have this many bits of color, or 8-bit, 12-bit, 10-bit. How do you want me to just use those numbers to describe the brightness and the color on the triangle? So we're not making the file size any bigger. So HDR does not make your file size bigger. It was all the other things we talked about. So the result for a customer is you get a color should be thought of as a big cube of colors. The triangle that can be described is the base, and the brightness makes the height. The bigger the triangle and the more brightness, the bigger the box of colors you can describe. And that's why when you look at HDR content, roses, flowers, really bright fabrics just pop, and they look a lot more realistic because I have a bigger cube of colors that I can describe. And you just end up with a much more vibrant, much more lifelike picture that looks closer to reality. So that is the benefit for HDR. So when it comes to HDMI 2.1, the new format, the things that have been enhanced is now you just have more resolution and more frames. So now I went from 4K to 8K, and I went from 24 frames that you normally see in a movie, or 30 frames you normally see in a broadcast, to up to 120 frames per second. So that is the main difference between the two. So do we have any questions so far?
We do. There was one pretty good one. Frederick actually answered it quite nicely.
Mm-hmm.
But if 60 frame video is better than 24, why does the standard for cinema, stay at 24 frames? And then one other one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to wait, and then you can answer them both. Mm-hmm. In AV market, which is a source that can generate 4K at 60,444?
Good questions. Okay, so the first thing, there is I'm not saying 60 frames is better. 60 frames gives you, the more frames you have, the smoother your motion's going to be. If I have a car that's moving across the screen, and I can only I can only photograph it here, and then the next time I photograph it, it's way over here, you end up with kind of a really juddery kind of motion. The more frames I have to describe it, the smoother the motion is. People don't like that, believe it or not, and when they watch movies, they love it when they're watching sporting events. So if you're watching cricket, American football, European football, the ball it's easier to track the ball, it's easier to follow the athletes. People love it when it comes to sporting events. With video, people say it looks, with movies, they say it looks like a soap opera. It doesn't have that movie-like feel. It doesn't look as expensive. So movie people actually prefer 24. It's not the fact that 24 is better, it's just we're used to looking at it that way. And it actually helps the studios too, because if I'm making a movie and I'm panning across a battlefield, the fact that I only have 24 frames, that little bit of blur that's caused or that little bit of judder that is caused hides the fact that the set is being held up by a stick. Okay, if I make something 60 frames or 120 frames per second, it's so crisp and so clean as I pass across it, everything has to be better. The costumes have to be better and everything else. Lord of the Rings was shot in 60p, and they said that all of the costumes had to be much, much better because of that, because it was easy to see that stuff is fake. So 24 frames is a preference for movies. And that's an important point, because we're going to talk about some really big numbers and 8K 60p, and it has to be this much bandwidth. But most of the stuff that customers are going to want to watch is going to be shot in 24p, so you really don't need all of that resolution. Now, the other question was, what was the other question, Jim? It was
which source can generate 4K at 60 with 444? And then there's also a new well, there's several new questions. You'll be shocked. Which application uses 120 frames per second?
Okay, well, it's pretty simple. For both of those questions, what can do it? A high-end game system. That's it. If you look at your 4K Blu-ray, 4K Blu-ray lives on the disc at 10-bit 420 at 24p. Eventually it becomes 444 because on the screen you see all of the colors. So something takes the 420, whether it's the source device like your Blu-ray player or the TV, and up converts it to 444. The only device that you can really buy right now that actually makes that can do it is a video game, because it makes each frame itself. When you're playing a video game, and a high-end graphics card can make an actual 12-bit 444 frame if it wants to. But that's about it. When you talk about video gaming, when you talk about 120 frames per second, the only thing that's really readily available that can generate that is a very powerful game system. So both of the questions are, if you're gaming, if you're a hardcore gamer with a computer the size of a small refrigerator, you could have 4K, 120, 444, all of that stuff. But the average person watching a movie, that's not really how things are done. Okay? So any other questions before I move on?
Oh, yes. That's
what we did 2 hours. That's what we did 2 sessions. Okay.
Why is there no standardization in the frame rate all over the world? Why is there 24, 25, 50, 60, 30, 120, et cetera, et cetera? And then another question. Boy, there's a lot of good questions. What about the aspect ratio? Will that too affect the bandwidth, IMAX format versus anamorphic letterbox mode? Are they more bandwidth compared to conventional 16:9? And then how deep do you want to go? What's the difference between 4.2.0 and 4.4.4?
Okay, we will get to all of that. So let's go down the first thing. Differences in frame rates. The first thing is movies were shot in 24 because that was the least amount of frames I could use and still make it look like things were moving. It wasn't when they did it in the early 1900s. It wasn't because it looked good. It was because film was expensive, and they said, what's the minimum amount of frames that I could use to portray motion? And you just got used to the look. So that's why that exists. The 50 and 60, I believe, may have something to do with, that's a good one, but I'm just thinking it because we use 60 hertz over here and many other countries use 50 hertz. And maybe that's just because of they decided to utilize a different, I don't know. That's a good question about why one company chose 50 and why one chose 60. Why do some people drive on the left and why do some people drive on the right? It could have just been a display system, the display options they had, the cameras that they had, the electrical systems that are in each region. I don't really know. The 120 and the 60 means is just because digital files are cheaper than film. The capability was there, so they said, why don't we crank it up? And originally 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second is used for slow motion. Most video cameras, when you're watching a football game, actually shoots at 60 to 120 frames per second. So that's why when you look at when they do instant replays on your soccer or football games, you'll notice that how crisp and how much detail is now available in slow motion. So it's normally used in it's been around for a while. Because we're not using film anymore, it's easier to shoot digital files at higher frame rates. It's just a lot of data, so broadcasters don't want to use it, and people in the cinema just don't like the way it looks. When it comes to aspect ratios, it's still the amount of pixels. Remember, if I have an 8 megapixel file, it is 2 million by, basically 2,000 by 4,000. It doesn't matter how I change up the files. If I have 8, it's how many pixels are in that aspect ratio. So if it's this big, if it's shaped like this, it can have the same amount of 8 megapixels. And if it's built like a regular square, it can have still 8 megapixels. It doesn't matter. It could be a triangle and still be 8 megapixels. It's how many pixels are used to make up that shape. So aspect ratios have no effect on file size. It's the amount of pixels used in the aspect ratio. And 24 was just chosen for movies because they like it. And in Europe, they decided to use 25. And that's
I can actually pinch in a little bit about that, Joe. Phil, you're absolutely correct. It's when film moved TV to the TV broadcast, people watching the TV broadcasts of the movies, it was either 25 frames or 30 frames based on where you were living. You had 110 volts in the US, where there's NTSC, that was 30. And then in European countries, you had PAL, which is 25 frames. So the 50 and the 60 you're seeing are actually multiples of those frequencies.
Exactly. So it all depends on the region. The picture, the video quality looks really good. Movie theaters decided to stick with 24 because movies are released internationally. So most movies, they just shoot it in 24, especially the US and even a lot of other countries, because they know they want their movies to be shared in multiple places, and everybody's used to 24, the look of 24. We'll get to the 444 in a second in major detail a little bit longer, a little bit down the line, and as we go along. Now, as you can see,
would now be the time to talk about refresh rate and frame rate, and is that the same or different?
That is a very good question. Refresh rate and frame rate is kind of discuss the same thing. Frame rate is the files that are being provided. How many frames per second are being provided to the TV? So, and then refresh rate is how often does the TV rewrite the picture. Most television sets, by the way, are use use 60 hertz or 120 hertz refresh rates. So basically, if I'm watching 24p content on a regular TV, if I'm watching 24p content on a normal brand new LCD TV, the native refresh rate of that panel is 120 frames per second. So what the panel does is just show you the same frame 5 times, and before it moves on to the next one. So the video sends a frame rate of 24p. It gets there, but the panel's refreshing 120 times a second. So what it's doing is it just shows that frame A, frame A, frame A, frame A, frame A, frame A. Then it goes frame B, frame B, frame. So it just basically shows the same frame over and over and over again. So refresh rate is how quick does the TV write its display, its image, and frame rate is the content. How many frames are in the particular content? But and most of the times, the reason why you're starting to see 4K 120 video is the native frame rate of the panel is 120. So I might as well utilize that to increase the motion resolution, which is why you're starting to see it. Oh, and by the way, most 8K panels have a refresh rate of 60, which is why you see that as well. Okay, these are all, as you can see, this is why we wanted to divide the AVR specific model conversation apart from the conversation about the technologies, because like I said, we could spend hours just talking about the physical makeup of the technologies. So anyway, increasing the amount of resolution and increasing the amount of frames meant that there's more data going down the pipe. Currently, HDMI cables are rated up to 18 gigabits per second. That's how much data, video data, can go down the line. Oh, by the way, there's separate channels for audio and all the other things. This is how much video can go down the lines in the cable dedicated to video. Before it was 18, and 18 was enough for 4K, 60p, HDR material. But because we want more than that, we need a new pipeline. So, and that is because you're going to start seeing gaming systems that can support it. Before, it used to be just massive PC gamers, but now the big gaming consoles, the processing is getting more and more powerful. So things like the new Xbox or the new, let me go back to my slide here. I got to put that back up. So go back here real quick. That's why I have this backed up. So new line to support 48, like we talked about. 48 is required for uncompressed 8K at 60 frames per second and uncompressed 4K at 120 frames per second. If you want to watch 8K movies, which are going to be in 24 frames per second, you don't need 48. That's less than half of 60. So you're looking at probably 22 gigabits per second for 8K at 24, but that's still bigger than what was the standard for HDR. The new game systems, Xbox, Sony, PS5 are coming out, and these, because of new video processing, can support the higher frame rates, and because of the higher processing. We have learned that most gamers are more interested in utilizing the processing power for higher frame rate. The more frames you show per second, the crisper the motion is, the more responsive the system is. And if you're a gamer, if I see you before you see me, I normally win, especially if I'm playing some sort of first-person shooter or some sort of basketball game. The more responsive your system is, the quicker I am at the sport, or the better I am in some sort of one-on-one combat between the two things. So they tend to prefer the higher resolution. And most game companies are focusing on maximizing frame rate more than they are maximizing resolution. This year, the TV manufacturers are really starting to promote the fact that they have 8K and 4K 120 panels because of HDMI 2.1. So that's really great. But I will also point out that if you go to most manufacturers, of the 8 or 9 models that they're selling, if you're lucky, you'll see one 8K series and maybe 1 or 2 4K high frame rate series. The majority of the TVs will have the HDMI 2.1 HDMI board on it, but they won't be using it. The benefits to the consumer will not be more frame rate and more resolution. There's more benefits to 2.1, which we will cover tomorrow, that even if you have a standard 4K TV with a standard panel, you're still going to get some benefits, okay? We'll talk about that tomorrow. We're just talking resolution and data today. So we talked about this 48 gigabits per second. If I grab a cable here, see if I can find one here that I can grab. If I grab a cable should, if you ever buy an HDMI cable, there's a lot of funky numbers, 444, 8K, 4K 60, 4K 60p, none of that matters. For HDR, you see that 18 right there? That is what matters. 18 tells you that this cable can meet the maximum that you can get from 4K HDR. All the rest of that stuff manufacturers use to dazzle you with big numbers, but I can trick those numbers and give you a lousy picture with 444. So what you need to be concerned with when you buy any cable or any long distance item, can it support 18 gigabits per second? When you start getting into the HDMI 2.1 cables, if you look there, you see that 48? That is what matters, not 2.1, not all the other stuff, but you'll see that 48 right there. And above, you'll see there's a lot of other features, Dolby Vision, 8K, FRL, VRR. That's all the other benefits of this particular technology. So this is what you should look at. The number, if you look at the actual number of your specific cable at the specific link you're looking for, you will always be prepared. If you look at all that other stuff that seems really good on paper, it's a good way for them to hide what that cable will do for you. So that's why people ask me, why are we even having this conversation? Because 90% of the time when there's a problem with the video, they always seem to blame either the TV or the receiver. They say, hey, I plugged the source directly into the TV and it worked. And now I put the receiver in between and it does not. And 90% of the time it has nothing to do with with the AVR. It has to do with the cables that you're using and the combination of the cable going from the source to the receiver and from the receiver to the TV can't support the bandwidth, and you're having problems. So the reason why I'm having this whole conversation is to help you understand how these cables work so you don't blame the AVR. All right, so keep that in. So that's why we're having this conversation today. So when it comes to cables, we talked about on the new cable 48. So 48. If I get that 48 gigabit cable that's rated, I am good for the maximum that you can get from HDMI 2.1, the maximum. However, there's a few things we need to get across when we talk about 2.1. Number one, there are no external HDMI 2.1 movie sources available. Nothing that supports HDMI 8K 60 or 4K 120. No movies. Okay. The next thing, and there's a couple things about that. There's no physical media. You cannot put an 8K movie on a 4K Blu-ray. There's too much data and there's not a way to compress it enough. So think of it like you'd have to have 6 discs in the pack, and every 20 minutes you would have to go in and swap the disc if you want to use the current compression scheme that's used on 4K Blu-ray to show 8K 60. So that's not going to work. The next thing is there's no streaming devices, no 8K Roku, no 8K Apple TV available. They just don't exist. And no one has announced that they're going to make one. There's no cable, while they're doing testing, there's no true, in Japan, they will be doing some testing with 8K set-top boxes. Most other places, no cable and satellite set-top boxes for wide distribution are available. And there's a reason for that as well. If there's no movie content at 8K 60 or 4K 120, there's nothing to show on the box. The cable companies already, think about how many 4K channels you have right now. Think about how many 4K channels you have right now. Most cable companies are not offering 4K channels. Why? Because I'd have to give up 4 HD channels to give you 1 4K channel. So if they won't give up 4 HD channels to give you 1 4K channel, they're not going to give up 16 HD channels to give you 1 8K channel. So they don't want to distribute it. The studios don't want to make it. There's no way to compress it and sell it. The movie screens in every movie theater is at maximum 4K. There's no place to distribute the content. There's no one to make the content. So there's this chicken and egg. Nobody wants to make a player until there's content to sell, and no one wants to sell unless there's a way to distribute it. So when it comes to movie content, not really something you're going to see at these massive frame rates. Okay. The next thing, there are, like we said, PlayStation and Xbox systems will support it, but that's okay. You just basically, most people are going to plug that game system close to the TV so they can change disc and then you would feed the audio back from your TV to your new or existing AVR using what's called audio return channel or enhanced audio return channel, which is actually better quality audio, which we will discuss in detail tomorrow. If the only other option is normally the first services to show really high quality stuff is things like Netflix or a streaming service. And most TVs that are 8K or 4K 120 are going to have those streaming services built in. So that content can be shared to your receiver using ARC, audio return channel, or the better version, which was introduced for HDMI 2.1, eARC, which is available on many of our Denon and Marantz AVRs. So those two things, so 48 is great on paper, but it isn't something that is really something that's going to be realistically utilized at its full potential for several years. Any questions about that, Jim? I'm sure he's going to say, oh, yeah.
Oh yeah.
I know.
So let's see. How about, we'll start with this one. Which HDMI interconnect would you recommend and why? HDMI over optical, HDMI over Cat6, HD-based T, or conventional HDMI over 19-core twisted copper?
Optical, 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 optical. The best.
Okay.
Period.
Thank you.
Period. No discussion. And we'll talk about that in a few more slides down the line.
How much resolution is required to match the human eye?
There's this thing called visual acuity. And that's how much density is required in pixels before you start to see the pixels on the screen. Normally, so it all depends on how close you get to a particular object. That's where 4K came from. Originally, HD, the human eye was sharp enough that if I got within 3 picture heights of an HD TV, if I got within 3 picture heights of an HD TV, my eye was sharp enough to start seeing the dots or pixels that made up the image. When you go to 4K, the picture height, you can be as close as 1.5 picture heights from the TV. So a 75-inch TV, you could sit 3 feet from and barely see the pixels. 8K, the pixel density, it's 3/4 of a picture height, so 0.75. So you can basically walk up to a 100-inch TV and sit 2 feet from it and not see any pixels in the image. So that is how that normally works out. That's what the whole science of this came out, and that's the reason why TVs have gotten bigger. VCR was only 420p. So you would sit, from a 32-inch TV, you would sit 12 feet away or 10 feet away. Now I can have a 55-inch TV or a 75-inch TV that is 4K in the same spot and sit the same distance that I did from a 480p TV playing a VCR and still have that resolution. So if you notice, the TV sizes have continued to grow because you can fit a bigger image, a bigger screen in a room and sit at the same distance, and it still looks sharp and crisp. Okay, next question.
So let's see. Well, I don't know if you want to dive into this one. OLED versus QLED, which is better tech? But how much is the maximum length of HDMI?
It depends on the cable. And it depends on the bandwidth. The more data you run down the cable, the least effective the cable becomes. A good optical cable can pass 100 gigabits per second, which is double 2.1 for 70 meters. So it all depends on the cable you're using and how the cable is utilized. We have a whole thing on cables at the end of this, and we'll talk about the differences as we go along. Okay?
Okay. So when you get to the cables, will you mention why most manufacturers don't have ARC over their HDMI Cat6 extenders?
Absolutely. Actually, we'll get to that too. Okay, so let's continue on real quick. I think some of the questions are actually, I knew you were going to have these, so I added them to the back of the presentation. So let's continue on. So one thing I want you to remember, right now, if you have a Denon or Marantz AVR, current models, they support two of the upcoming HDMI 2.1 user enhancement and audio improvement features. ARC, which allows you to have uncompressed audio sent from the TV to the AVR. So if the app in the TV is doing Dolby Atmos at Blu-ray quality, DTS Master Audio, Dolby True HD, you will get that quality. It's the quality. So the limitation now with eARC is how good is the streaming service in the TV, not the transfer of the cable. Auto low latency mode, we'll talk about that and tomorrow. That improves gaming. Basically, when I'm watching video, the TV and the receiver is in its video enhancements are on. When I'm playing gaming, the TV and the receiver will automatically go into game mode because the player told it to. So that's something we will cover in detail tomorrow. But those features are available on our TV, on our receivers now, and have been available on models that we have had in market for over 2 years. So somebody, and of course, we'll talk about this tomorrow too. What if someone wants an HDMI 2.1 cable? They just have to have a receiver with the fancy logo and the 48. Normally, that customer is incredibly discerning. They're buying a very expensive display, some 8K TV. And 8K, the least expensive 8K TV on the market in the US is $4,000 US. The average price for one to get into the market is, the next one is about $8,000 US. So anybody who's buying a true 8K 60p TV is may be willing to also buy a high-end AVR or the best pre-pro to go with it. So these will be upgradable to 2.1 in the future. We will discuss that in detail tomorrow. So don't ask me a bunch of questions now, because I can't tell you now and I can't tell you when. So and then we'll talk more about that tomorrow during the next session. Okay, so let's get into cables. And then after we get into cables, then we will answer some more questions, because half the questions will probably get solved here. So we said that the new cables are going to have to be 48 at a maximum to maximize the full potential of HDMI 2.1. Now, if you look inside of a cable, an HDMI cable has a whole bunch of different strands in it. And each one of these strands, there's up to 19 wires, carry different things. Basically, currently, 3 of the big ones, they're called TMS ones with the red that says signal. Those are the ones that carry the video right now. The other cables you see are there for timing and to 5-volt voltage and CEC, Consumer Electronics Control, and audio and everything else. All of those other things go down the other lines. The only thing that goes down those TMS pairs are video. That's it. So if I look at this cable right now, this is the inside of a standard cable up to HDMI 2.0B, the stuff that we're talking about right now, 4K, 60p HDR. If you look, there's 3 channels, TMS 0, TMS 1, TMS channel 2. Those are the video channels. And each one of those video channels are capable of sending 6 gigabits per second. So 6 plus 6 plus 6 equals 18, which is the maximum of the cables that we're using right now. But if you notice, there's another TMS channel here that's not being used. That is used right now just to sync the signals. So think of, they send the blue down channel 0, the red down channel 1, and the green down channel 2. What the clock channel does is make sure that all 3 of those colors remain in sync. That's it. That's all that they're using that channel for. So someone said, I have all these channels and I'm only using 3 of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to rewire the way that a HDMI transmitter and an HDMI receiver utilizes the wires that are in the cable. So the physical cable is the same as it used to be. So your older cables can work. But now I'm using, I have 3 channels. And this is weird. It's red, green, blue, and then a combination of red, green, and blue on another line on that lane 3. But basically what you end up with at a minimum, if I take a good cable that I already have, is 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6 equals 24 gigabits per second. So just by doing this, I can accelerate the data from 18 to 24. Because I am because of this, I am utilizing the cable different. I can't just do a firmware update on the TV. The circuitry in the transmitter, which is in the source, and in the receiver, the chip that's in the TV, had to be rebuilt in order to use the lanes of traffic, to use this particular cable this way. So you can't do a firmware update to tell a TV to now use that clock channel. You have to rebuild it to turn the clock channel into that 4th lane. Okay, so that's why you cannot do a firmware update to get to full HDMI 2.1. So before, 3 lanes of the 4 channels were used to carry the signal. The 4th was just for timing. Because each channel was 6, you end up with 18. Now I'm using 4 channels, and 4 channels means of 6 means I'm already at 24. If I up the amount of bandwidth per channel to 12, I end up with 48. All right, so that's the best way to think of it. Now, if I go out and buy a very good cable, a very good HDMI cable that has 4 good channels in this, there's a good chance if this cable is only 3 feet, you could probably pass 12 per channel down here. So a lot of the better cables at shorter distances that you bought that were 18 gigabit rated will probably pass 48 at the shorter distances. As they get longer, it becomes far, far more challenging. The other thing that we have to point out is, remember, I need 48 to show 8K 60 at 12-bit color with 444, all these big numbers. The stuff that lives on the disk is not going to be in that resolution. So, for example, the movie is not going to be in 60p, it's going to be in 24p, which cuts it to 24. So if you have a good cable with 4 channels and you're watching an 8K movie in 2.1, most likely this cable will pass 8K 24 today. Okay, it's just that if the studio decide they want to do 8K at 444, you may exceed the capabilities of this cable. So let's continue on. So some other things they did is now they're adding what's called lossy compression. So you can actually compress the signal. So there's a way, lossy compression means that if I compress it and then I decompress it, you cannot tell the difference. So they've added another thing called DSD or DSC, digital stream compression, which means that that's another part of 2.1. There's a compressor in the transmitter, and there's a decompressor in the chipset that goes into the display. And that is part of the chipsets that you're going to see in these in every TV and every true HDMI 2.1 source, including gaming cards. So we have this 48, but let's talk about what you can do with this 48. This is an eye chart, but there's a few things I want to point out. Like we said, if I do right here, you'll see 4K at 120. If I do 4K at 422, which is a reduction, we'll talk about what that is. It's only 32, and that is 120 frames per second. It's less. It's a third less. So by the way, everybody goes, what is 444 and what is 422 and what is 420? 444 means that I sample the color and tell the TV the color of red, green, and blue every single time. So I sample the red 4 times, the green 4 times, the blue 4 times. 422 means I sample one color, green, or one of the colors all the time. And then the other 2 only sample every other time, 422. One's sampled all the time. The other two colors are sampled every other time. And the TV has mathematics to losslessly figure out what those extra colors are. That's the old, 3 minus X equals 4. I know what X is if I know mathematics. So I don't have to give you X every single time. So that's what they do. 420 means I sample 1 every single time. I sample another color half the time, and the 0 means I don't provide that other color, but I can still do mathematics to determine what that color is. So 444, all the colors are measured all the time. 422, one color measured all the time, the other two colors measured every other time. 420, one color measured all the time, one color measured every other time, and the other color is never provided, and the TV does mathematics. When you look at the video, you always see 444, period, because that's the only reason why you could see red, green, and blue makes the colors. So even though it may be 420 on the disc, by the time it reaches your eyes, it's 444. By sampling something every single time, it makes the file bigger than if I measure it every other time, or 420. So that's another thing that can make a file size much bigger. And 444, broadcasting 444 to do a display, a lot of times does not improve it over sending it just 420 or 420 or 422. And we'll get to that in a second. So what does that mean? Bigger is not always better. So let me show you what I mean. So this is the chart that we sent you, and it has every resolution for everything from HD all the way up to 10K. By using compression, 48 gigabits per second is good for 10K 120. If you look at the chart that I provided you, hopefully you will have a flying car, hopefully, before we have to go to another standard. Because by then, when they start making 10K 120 TVs, that's when it's going to be time to replace this standard. So this standard should be good for a very, very long time. If you look at the yellow, this is just an example of HDR that's available right now. If I do something like 444, depending on how much bit depth I use and how much subsampling I use, you could see big jumps in size. So if you look at the bottom, 444 10-bit 12-bit is 18, which is why the HDMI cable is rated for why HDMI 2.0 is rated for 18. But 420 with the same bit depth, 422 with the same bit depth is only 9. So going dropping the color sampling from 444 to 422 cuts the file size in half. And if I displayed both of these on a TV, if I set my Opal Blu-ray player to show you 444 or my Opal Blu-ray player to show you 422, it is impossible for the human to actually differentiate the difference between those two on a standard television set. So what's on the Blu-ray disc itself, the physical disc is encoded at 4K, 24p, 420. That is what's on the disc. So you taking your Blu-ray player and turning it up, or your Apple TV and turning it up to 444, you're letting, what's going to do a better job of converting 420 to 444? Your $100 or $200 Apple TV or your $4,000 US television set. Let the TV or the projector do the upsampling. It will do a better job than the source, and it will make the files smaller, which means you can have cables will go longer before you hit their limitations. So this is what just because you can do this in your Blu-ray player, don't do it, because you're not making the picture any better. Let the projector or the TV do it, okay? Because if you have one cable in your system that cannot support that 12-bit 444 or that 13, the whole system will fail. Do not crank it up just because you can. The analogy I use is, it's like you going out and buying your spouse a beautiful diamond ring, and instead of sending it to her in the little box, you shove it in a shipping container. It doesn't make the ring any shinier. It doesn't make the ring any prettier. It just makes it harder to move from point A to point B. So don't go into Blu-ray players and crank up the settings to maximum, because you're not going to get any real benefit from it. Here's another example. The number you should be most concerned with is, when you talk about good color, is bit depth, not sampling. What you can see there is 8-bit 444, which can give you 16 million colors at almost 9 gigabits per second, versus 10-bit 422, which gives you a billion colors and the file size is smaller. The picture is better with the lower subsampling number. Don't fall for turning everything up to 444. That's why I told you, if you look at the 444 number on a box, don't pay attention to it. What matters is 18, how much bandwidth the cable can support, not the fancy number, because the big number may not equate to a better picture. Okay, so that's why I tell you that. Don't just randomly go into Blu-ray sources and crank them up. If you have an Apple TV, set it to match frame rate and match format in the menu, and you will end up with a much better picture, and your cables will work, and you'll have less problems with cables, your AVR, and your display if you do that, okay? Because it's not being artificially, the content is not being artificially boosted. Okay, so we talked about this. The longer the cable, the more, the harder it is to expand, to pass bandwidth for longer lengths. So the first thing you need to do is make sure you don't turn stuff up unnecessarily, which makes your cables fail. The next thing is the kind of cable you use is important. It's really, it's really tempting. These baluns are good for extending cables for long distances, but many of these baluns that are HD base T do not support ARC. So you go out and you buy that beautiful cable, now that there's these baluns, and you can extend it from one room to another. But when I'm trying to pass audio from that TV's internal source back to the receiver, it does not pass ARC. That's not saying that you can't buy cables that can. So this is a balun that supports it. And if you look here, if it supports it, they will put it on the box. Features ARC. If it's not on the box, most likely the balun you're buying does not support it, because if it did, they would label it all over the box and all over the device. All right. So if you're going to use baluns like these, and you want to make sure that you're ready for the future, utilizing your existing receivers with 8K TVs and 8K game systems, you better make sure that that HD base T supports at least audio return channel. And most likely, if it supports audio return channel, it'll probably have enough data to support eARC as well. Okay, the next thing, you are starting to see HDMI 2.1 cables available. This is a Belkin copper that's good for a maximum of 6.6 feet. That's it. Most of the time, you're not going to see very many passive copper cables that can support distances more than 6 to 8 feet. I can make it longer, but I'd have to make the cable much, much thicker, because each line that's sending the signal has to be beefier to go the longer distance. It's like making the pipe thicker, bigger, to push water a longer distance easier, okay? Most cables, I'm sorry, let me show you the Belkin real quick. So here is people say, what's the Belkin? Here is a Belkin that can support HDMI that was just announced. And believe me, if you can do it, they're going to promote it. The next way to improve or enhance the length of the capabilities of an HDMI cable is to make it active. If you look here, this cable actually has a little cord on it. It has an amplifier built into it to force the video down the line. So now I can actually have whenever you see super long HDMI cables, even that are HDR ready, they are normally active cables if they are copper in order to push the signal. This little tip here, this side plugs into the display, and this tip you power with a cell phone power adapter. Even if the TV has an HDMI, a USB on it, don't use that. Use a wall adapter, because this power has to always work in order for this to work. These cables are omnidirectional. They only go one way. You plug them in the wrong way, they do not work. Whenever you see a super thin cable, like this guy here, this is a super thin old school HDMI cable. You'll notice that it says TV. This one says TV and source, or display and source. Whenever you see a bidirectional, a one-way cable, it's an active cable. The only reason why they do that is there's an amplifier in here. But instead of being powered by the little wall wart thing that plugs in, this is being powered by the display. Don't really like this, because if the displays have that little 5 volts of power that's built into the display, tends to drift. And the second it drops below 4 volts or so, you end up with failures and your picture blanks out. You got to unplug the cable and plug the cable back in. So ones that are powered externally are normally more reliable than these types of cables. Moving on, if you really want to step up, it looks like copper, but this is an active optical cable. So this cable is fiber optic, and this sucker is 20 meters, 66 feet of cable. It has an amplifier built into it, and what you do is, I can power this from my TV, but the company does not want you to do that. So they give you a little amplifier that you can plug into a cell phone adapter to keep this cable powered effectively. All right. Optical, the distances are always going to be much, 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 much longer. If you want to move up to even more, oops, sorry, let me go back to that cable here. I didn't show you what the cable was called. That is this cable here. It's called a bullet train. This is available from a company called AV Pro Store. They actually sell this cable. And you notice it says 48 on the cable. All of their cables are labeled. So you know that if you buy a cable, it supports the bandwidth. The next thing is fiber. So this is raw fiber that you could pull into a wall. So you pull this early, even if the customer doesn't need it right now. And but fiber is good to up to 100 gigabits per second. So way, way, way beyond what is required. So this fiber, I could run this a kilometer, 1,000 meters, some of this cable, and still pass that signal. This stuff is amazing, because now instead of passing copper, I'm just blinking a light down this line. And the capability of this stuff is spectacular. And this, by the way, has a protective jacket on it. This here, to show you how thin this wire is, this is 75 feet of fiber. And you can see the size of that cable, 75 feet of cable. So very, very tiny, very powerful stuff. Now, there's multiple ways you can use fiber. You can use like this spool that I have here, and that's pre-terminated, and they offer balance for this, just like if you look at the balance for your HD base T, and they offer balance for that type of cable. So there's a balun right here that I could use for that type of cable. So this balun right here is, you use fiber on it. Pull it out, pull it out, pull it out, pull it out. It's gonna rip my bag. Is this the right one? No, wrong one. Nope, right one. If you look there, oh, let me go larger. The fiber, you pull this off and the fiber plugs in right there, and it converts it into HDMI, those HDMI outputs. This sucker supports ARC, bidirectional, everything, bidirectional signals, eARC, Ethernet through the wire, two-way IR, everything. You can even run RS-232 down this thing. So this thing is ridiculous because fiber can support a huge amount of data. Moving on from that, there are other cables that are optical, that are copper, that are active, or optical that are active. These are actually the Velox is actually a active copper cable. The AudioQuest is actually an optical cable. Both of these are rated right now for 18. But remember, that's only 18 using 3 of the. Oh, sorry. Oh, I keep forgetting to switch back. So the Metra is a copper optical cable. That is this guy right here. Okay. Oh, sorry, upside down. That's this guy here. This is an optical. This is a copper cable that is amplified. The AudioQuest is actually an optical cable with that is amplified. So both of these cables are readily available. They're very popular. I actually use the AudioQuest in my home right now to run from my AVR 8805 to my projector, and it works spectacularly, and it will also support ARC. Now these are only rated for 18, but remember they were only using 3 of the channels. There's 4 channels in this cable, so most likely both of these cables are good for 50 meters. Like the AudioQuest is probably good for 15 meters at 24, which is enough to do 8K at 24p, or even 8K at 60p if you set your display, your game card to 422 instead of 444. Moving on here, as you can. The other way is these are other examples of fiber cables. Like for example, the Celerity is rated for 1,000 feet, which is what, close to 300 meters at least 18 gigabits per second. So lots and lots of options. Optical is probably the way to go. Worst comes to worst, if you don't always pull conduit in the house, because if you have to go back in, or it's easier to pull that old wire out and put the new wire in. If you already have a piece of cable in the wall, copper, and it's not active and it's not optical, there are also solutions. This is actually what's called a gigabit accelerator available by a company called Metra. And basically it takes a passive HDMI cable and makes it active. So say you had a cable in the wall that was kind of iffy for HDR, I can put this accelerator on it and take that cable and make it work for 18 and probably higher. So there are solutions out there for even if you have older copper HDMI cables. All right, Jim, let the questions come flying.
All right. So let's see. We will start with, what about HDCP or CP 2.2 against HDMI 2.1? Is HDCP changing at all?
There is a new HDCP. It's called HDCP 2.3. It is backwards compatible with 2.2. It was designed, each time there's an increase in resolution, they increase the copyright protection. It's just copyright protection. The reason why we use HDMI is because they could add copyright protection to it. There's better professional tools like 3G and 12G SDI that is used for professional broadcasting, or even display ports and things like that, but there's no copy protection capability. So the only reason why we use HDMI is because the studios want to make sure that you do not copy their content. And each time they increase the resolution, they increase the copy protection. If you have most older receivers are backwards compatible with 2.3. So anything that can go down that line through that receiver, the receiver will have rights to. By the time it gets to something that is above its copyright capabilities, it can't pass that type of bandwidth anyway, so don't worry about it. Next question.
Is there any way to identify, measure the speed type 1.4, 2.0, etc. of the HDMI cable to verify if OEM is giving what is written on the box? So they're asking about testers. And then the other thing is, are there any 8K testers available yet?
So testing, notice what's next. There are ways to verify, and I tell people always verify your cables. If you look at that rack back there, there is several sources going to a TV, a projector. I'm sending it out to a second zone over my fireplace. And before I put all those balance and all that stuff in, I checked everything, because if one cable's bad and it does not have rights, say you have an 8x8 matrix switch. If I have one bad cable, I can bring down that entire system. So I say always verify your cables. Now,
before we get to this, Phil,
yes,
let's go back to the, let's table this for a second. Let me get through some of the other questions, and then we can come back to that. Okay. So do you suggest we set the settings in the Blu-ray players to auto, or turn it to off? Also the AVRs.
Okay, so here's the thing. When it comes to the AVR, the main thing with the AVR you need to do is go into the AVR's internal its settings and set the HDMIs to enhanced. Most of them are defaulted to standard, because standard makes those inputs backwards compatible with really, really old HDMI sources. So the first thing you should do is go in and set either all of the inputs or select inputs, if depending on the AVR, to enhance, which means I can accept the maximum that you can of 18 or whatever that's going to be on our current AVRs, which is the maximum that 4K 60p can provide of HDMI 2.0B. So first thing in the receivers, set them to enhanced. When it comes to most Blu-ray players, they do a lot of them are set to 444. If you can go into the menu and set it to 422, do that. If not, leave it in auto. If you can set it to 422 or 420, do that. But most of the time it's going to be, you'll have a 444 option and a 422 option, which is found in the Oppo Blu-ray player behind me, as well as things like the Sony. If you do that, that cable that failed at 12 feet will probably pass the video. So I would tell you to do that one setting and then leave everything else at auto. Do not turn it up to 12-bit. Even if you have the option, I go in that Oppo and make it 12-bit 444 and crash most systems that we send them that you utilize. So if you can leave it at 10-bit or set it to 10-bit, do that. And if you can set it at 420, do that. The main thing that you have to be concerned with is something like an Apple TV. Apple TVs, if you look at video, a lot of times when you switch from one frame rate to another, you get a black picture. And there's a new setting or a new feature in 2.1 to eliminate that. But right now TVs don't have that feature. And customers did not like the fact that when you switch from the menu to video or from HDR to SDR, you would get a blank screen. They thought it was broken. So Apple TVs take everything you're watching and upconvert it to 4K HDR at 60p. So if you're watching a HD movie in 24p, the Apple TV is outputting it at 4K 60. That does not look right. Your TV doesn't blank between the menu and the movie, but it doesn't look as good. If you go into an Apple TV, you will see what's called match frame rate and match format, which means play SDR as SDR, play HDR as HDR. If it's 24p, play it in 24p. If it's 50p, play it at 50p. Don't mess with the picture. And if you do that, the file size gets smaller, the picture gets much better. Okay. So those are two massive tips that I could tell you. All right, come on, Jim. Anything? We'll continue.
First off, we need to say thank you to everybody because we're over. You'll be shocked to
Yes.
know we're way over.
I kind of figured we went an hour. So this so let me figure these last 3 slides, and then we'll go back to the questions. So people have to jump off, okay? And then we'll come back and we will load up stuff that is not answered by these last 2 slides.
Okay.
Verify.
Hold on before you go. Reminder that if you want to look at the separate slides in the handouts tab of the little control box that should be up on your computer screen, there is an HDMI 2.1 bandwidth chart, and then also a copy of this presentation for you to download.
Exactly. So you ain't got to take notes. So when I was talking about now, the cables I put in there are just ones that I have played with or tested that I know work. But I'm sure there's multiple other cables. But I want you to ask questions. What's the maximum bandwidth that this cable supports at this length? Don't let them just tell you 18, because that series cable may support 18 at 8 feet. What does it support if I buy this 12-foot cable or this 6-meter cable? What is the maximum bandwidth this 6-meter cable you're trying to sell me for supports? That's the number one question. And if they start talking 444, no. What's the maximum bandwidth this cable supports? And what's the maximum bandwidth this balun supports? And if it's a balun, does it support at least arc? Make them answer those questions. If they dance around it, that's telling you that it does not. Okay, so keep that in mind. And as you get into 2.1, what's the maximum? And if they say 48 and arc, you are good. Okay. The next thing. So moving on, test your cables. There's multiple ways to test your cables. I am a certified projector reviewer, and I also do custom installation. So I have a variety of these test pattern generators. So what I did was, one is a transmitter, one is a generator, and one is an analyzer. And I put the cable in, and it will tell me. I set this one to 8K 60 at 444, and then I read the other one to see if it comes out 8K 60 at 444. So there's these types of ones. These run about 5,000 US. So most people, the quantum data, the quantum data unit runs around 7,000 US. The Meridio Fox and Hounds, that's their kind of ones that are specifically done just for testing. Those are $2,400 a set. And of course, these are all designed for 18. Meridio, the company that makes the 6G and the 6A, come out with a new piece called a 7G, which I have over here, which I will show you tomorrow. That is designed for HDMI 2.1. It can test. Eventually, it'll be able to test 8K, eARC, sync, everything. And that one runs around $7,000. Don't have a heart attack. We have a solution for you. Because we realized that people always blame the black box, the receiver, for problems, we decided to add an HDMI diagnostics tool to every Denon and Marantz AVR. There is a specific button push that varies from model to model, and when you push those buttons, you can bring up a testing capability. You plug the HDMI cable into the monitor out and cable 1. Input number 1, and it will test the cable to determine what the bandwidths are. Currently, this tests up to 18. When we go to our 8K, to our HDMI 2.1 models, they will test far higher. So you could test your cables using your AVR. So instead of you having to go out and spend at minimum $2,500 US to buy a piece of testing equipment, you could use the receivers that you sell right now to test those cables. If you want to know what this formats are, this is kind of like something, talk to your reps or your distributors for this material, or Frederick can get it to you. We normally don't share these because you're really getting into the receiver's deep menu systems, and it's almost, you could kind of mess the thing up. So we want to make sure that we save it to those people who are more comfortable with technically savvy stuff like this. So it's not something that's normally shared with a consumer. But if you're on this call, you seem to be technically savvy, contact your distributors as well as Frederick, and we will try to make sure that we get you the instructions on how to do this. So I believe this is a great thing, and it shows our commitment to making sure that your systems are set up properly. Okay. For product stuff, like I said, we're going to talk about that tomorrow. So if you start asking me about how to connect this to the AVR and what works with this, save those questions for tomorrow. We just want to answer the bandwidth and the technical questions. So we are done. And now, Jim, we can just answer questions.
Okay. Please don't share those testing documents, and no, they are not mentioned in the manual, but please
Yes.
don't post them anywhere publicly.
Exactly. Yes, because what
You
happens,
want to tell them why, Phil?
You post it publicly, and the customer goes in and starts hitting buttons, and he basically bricks his receiver. So brick means he messes up the video, and the video never works anymore, and he doesn't know how to get back into it and fix it. So it's something for someone who really wants to take care and knows what they're doing. So we really say this is not for the consumer. This is for people who are installers and everything else. Just like you wouldn't let a customer run his own power in the wall because he could hurt himself. You don't want the customer messing with this themselves because they could damage their product. Okay, it's like going into the service menu of a TV. You can do a lot in that service menu, but you can also damage your TV. So that's why manufacturers do not share how to get into the service menus with the average consumer.
And we'll talk more about that tomorrow morning, or tomorrow, right? During
Exactly.
that session.
We'll talk more about that tomorrow. All right.
Here comes the questions. UHD 4K 3840 by 2160 and native 4K 4096 by 2160. Are those two resolutions differentiable by the human eye?
So what was the resolutions again?
3840 by 2160 and 4096 by 2160.
No. The difference between the two is a K is 1024. So 4096 is 4K. That's where 4K comes from. So so studio cameras shoot in Ks, 2K and 4K. So that's where the 4096 comes from. However, 4K is 16 by 10, not 16 by 9. So actually 17 by 10. It's a weird aspect ratio. So what they did was they shoot it in 4K and they lop off basically 100 pixels on the top and a couple of 100 pixels on the bottom to make for regular UHD. So 4096 is professional 4K capture for content, but UHD is 16 by 9, which is where the 3840 comes from. So the human eye cannot discern that. All they're doing is basically lopping off the top and the bottom. Oh, by the way, most letterbox movies you watch, that's all they did. They shot it square, and then they just lop off the model, the top and the bottom, and you go, ooh, look at the widescreen. Okay.
It's all about the director's intent, right?
Director's intent. But you will, if I play a 4096 on a standard 4K TV, you would have small bars on the top and the bottom. Okay. So most people don't want the small bars on the top and the bottom, so they just lop that extra content off to play back on a 4K TV.
Why do you call HDMI extenders balance?
It all depends. HDMI extenders, originally, sometimes you'll look at a box, they call them HDMI extenders, they call them HDMI balance. It's kind of a universal term. Both of them mean the same thing. Balance means basically goes in one way, comes out another. So goes in HDMI, convert it to optical, or convert it to HD-based T, and when it gets the other side, it's reconverted. So that's the term for a balun means conversions like that. Extender means I'm just extending the signal. So they're both talking about the same thing. It's just one is kind of explaining what is being done, and the other one's talking about what is the benefit.
Does the optical cable also have a direction?
The optical cable, this wire right here, that is just bare wire, has no direction. When I put a tip on that wire, the reason why it has a direction is because the amplifier is on the side that plugs into the display. The amplifier is part of the display side. So the second I put the ends on, it becomes directional because this end has to be plugged into the TV. So the wire's not directional, it's the tips that they put on the wire that makes it all of a sudden directional.
Okay, I'm not sure, but I'm gonna I'm not sure what the question actually is, but what happens when you send 4K content via 4K source through HD receiver to 4K screen projector? Can the scaled image be 4K? Should
if
be.
you send a 4K source to an HD receiver, the HD receiver does not have writes, so the 4K source is going to knock it down to HD, and it's going to go to the receiver, to the projector, and the projector is going to, or the TV is going to upscale it to 4K. So just like every TV shows you 444, because you got to use all the red, green, and blue, every 4K display has to show you 8.83 million pixels or whatever that number is going to be. So it's going to either be, so your colors get upsampled and your resolution gets up converted, because that's the only thing the TV can display. So if you want 4K all the way down the line, everything has to support 4K. That HD player does not have the rights. There's what's called an edit. The source asks everything down the line, who are you and what do you have rights to? It asks the balun or extender. It asks the extender's transmitter, who are you? It asks the extender's receiver, who are you? It asks the receiver, your AVR, who are you? And then it asks the display, who are you? And if one of those say, I am not ready for 4K HDR, or I don't have rights to 4K or HDR or 8K or whatever that's going to be, the source will not send it. The problem with a VC with having two displays is, say I have a projector and a TV. My Sony TV has 18 gigabit HDMI inputs. My older Sony 4K HDR projector only had 10. So they identified themselves as both HDR 4K, and the Apple TV tried to send them both 18. So I got a picture on the TV and no picture on the projector. The second I went in and set that Apple TV to match frame rate and match format, the file size became 10. And now I got a picture on my TV and a picture on my projector. So everything has to have rights and identify, or you will not get that content sent down the pipe.
What setting should you use on an Apple TV in frame rate and dynamic range?
Match format for dynamic range, and match frame rate for the other one. You'll see it in the menu. Go in there immediately and make that change. Immediately. It will blank match format and match frame rate. Immediately. I actually wrote it off. When I was at my other job, I'm the one that kind of pointed that out to Consumer Reports, and they actually hammered them about that introduction. And that's one of the reasons why you see that setting, is because myself, Consumer Reports, CNET, and all those guys leaned on them, and they actually made that update.
Okay. Here we go. Why is it that ARC works sometimes and sometimes not so much?
The older ARC was not very reliable. So if you had an older TV when it first came out and an older receiver, sometimes you would have problems. Now each manufacturer has worked for years to make audio return channel better, especially start getting into better television sets. There is a few things that you have to notice. Most of the time, even on our receivers, you have to make sure that ARC is enabled. And also on the TV, you have to make sure that it is enabled. Sometime on older TVs, ARC was also connected to the CEC, so they may not have been a separate way to engage it. So, for example, on the older Sonys, it was called Bravia Sync, and that turned on CEC and audio return channel. Now on a Sony TV, you can turn on Bravia Sync and then go into the Bravia Sync setting and leave a audio return channel on and turn off consumer electronics control, so it doesn't mess with your control systems. So each manufacturer has their own way of setting it up. You have to refer to their manuals because they're all completely different. Each manufacturer supports different levels of audio return channel. Samsung has said they're not going to support eARC, but Sony and LG said they are. So you have to talk to each manufacturer. They will all support ARC, but you have to talk to the manufacturer about which TVs are going to support eARC.
It's been brought to my attention that Samsung seems to be the least reliable as far as getting ARC to work for whatever reason.
Yes, they are the 1,000-pound gorilla in the industry, and they can be a little stubborn. They want to do it their way, and they want everybody else to follow them. And the industry's like, no, we're going over here. So we're going that way, and you're going to have to go with us.
Okay. There's a question about throw some light on why HDMI boards go bad or misbehave. I'm just going to say it's more likely that the cable is bad as opposed to an HDMI board failure. But I will also say, at least in the US, there is one of the cable companies that has voltage spikes that will pass through their box and down the HDMI cable, and that will actually fry an input.
Yes, it will. And there's other things. Okay, so the first thing, go ahead, Jim, I'm sorry.
Oh, go. No, I was just going to say that's been most of our problems.
Exactly. So a lot of times it's the cable box sending a spike in voltage or the display sending a spike in voltage. The other thing that can happen if it's sporadic with your video, with your content is a lot of times these cables, you may not have known they were active, but they're active. Remember, the one that has a source and display are always active, and this is being powered by the display's voltage. And it was Sony's and a lot of other TVs are notorious for that 5 volts to drift a long time and the image to go out. And you'd have to physically unplug it and plug it back in, and you would literally see a spark on when you plugged it back into the receiver, and that would reactivate that voltage. So a lot of times it's sending bad voltage down or unstable 5 volt from the display that causes unreliability when it comes to active cables or ARC or anything else. Okay. So anything else, Jim?
I know. Oh, yeah. We're not done yet, buddy.
How many people? Man, these guys are still hanging on.
Oh, yeah.
For 200 people, plus. I will answer. I don't have anything to do today, so I will stay as long as you guys want to stay to talk about this stuff. We're not talking about products yet. That's tomorrow. Okay. So go ahead.
Sorry, I had to mute because I was laughing so hard. There was a question about sometimes when you turn on your TV first, let me get this back here. Switched on before the display, there's no video, and then you have to switch off the AVR and switching it back on.
Yes. What happens is, remember, each time there's a communication, there is that who are you communication, and sometimes you turn the TV on, and so the TV's trying to identify itself, but the receiver's not on yet. So the source says, who are you? And then it can't talk yet. So it says, no video. And then you cycle the receiver and it makes it do its sync again. So everybody says, all right, let's go back, and everybody introduce themselves again, and then your picture comes up. So a lot of times what happens if I have a control system, if you find that there is those types of issues, that determines on your macro, on your control system, how you turn things on. Or I've had it happen where I was on my projector and then I switch from my projector to my TV and the picture's not there. So I have to switch inputs or turn the receiver on and off to make the projector identify itself, or the TV to identify itself to the source so it can get a picture. It's normally just a communication thing. So neither you have to unplug the wire, you got to do something to make everybody talk to themselves again, talk to each other again.
All right, let's see. Why do most Denon AVRs not have the chassis ground pin in the IEC socket?
Wow, that's a good one. I am not sure. I'd have to look at that one. Oh, by the way, before I let you guys go, before people drop off, if you guys really want to get technical, if you haven't subscribed to our Sign Edit YouTube channel, I'm going to start adding a lot more stuff. I'm going to do one. I'm trying to do one this week on we're setting up the game mode in a receiver, and where is the enhanced inputs on there, and things like that. So these have a lot more technical, longer sessions with people such as the guy in the red is from Metra, AudioQuest, Luxo. Everybody's on there, so please subscribe. So that question, I'm going to have to look at that one. Maybe if I see it in writing, I will have a better understanding of what he's asking, and we will make sure that we can answer that particular question. Okay.
Okay. The inputs on HDMI ports of a Denon or a Marantz, media player, SAT cable, et cetera, do they mean anything with the frame rates, resolutions, et cetera?
No. What's nice about, and Jim will tell you, he used to go around and preach this before I even got here. If with the exception of one receiver, Jim, every single one, every single input is identical when it comes to quality. It's just labeled for convenience. And of course you can relabel them if you want to.
Correct. They're all the same, except for on the AVR S540 BT.
540, exactly. It's pretty much anything over what, except for one Denon, they're all identical.
Starting at $400 in Denon. Can
US,
you suggest any 4K projector with Dolby Vision 12-bit? As far as I know, all models in market only have HDR.
Okay, so there's two things. There is no consumer 12-bit display. Every OLED, the panels are all manufactured by basically two manufacturers. The panels that they buy are 10-bit panels, every single one. LG panels are all 10-bit. And so Sony, LG OLEDs, all 10-bit. Most LCD panels that are provided by companies like AOL, 10-bit panels, period. All right. So there is very little 10-bit stuff. There are 10-bit levels of projectors when it comes to imagers and things like that at the higher end models, but no projector supports Dolby Vision. Projectors are big dumb boxes. They don't have things such as, most of them don't have stuff such as ARC or dynamic HDR. They're not built that way. So you can get a 12-bit projector, but you can't get a Dolby Vision projector. We can go into a whole nother session on, because I do projector reviews as well, about why HDR is a mega challenge on a projector, because the brightness range in HDR is absolute. It's supposed to be 0 to 4,000 nits on a Blu-ray. A projector could barely do 0 to 75 or 100. So it's trying to fit all that extra information in a smaller space, and it never looks right, period. So eventually you may see Dolby Vision enabled projectors, but it's really difficult. And that's a whole nother conversation. If you email me at philipjones@soundunited.com, I will be happy to send you some information about why HDR and projection is just difficult. All right, so next question.
Why are there sometimes handshake issues between 4K AVR and 4K projector, even though only HD source or even no source is yet connected? Moreover, could this happen down the line due to a problem with an existing cable that worked earlier and then suddenly stopped working for some reason, or does it happen because of other issues between the AVR and the projector?
Yes, it could be a loss of sync, and you're using a splitter, and one says it has right, and then the source sees the other and does not believe it has right, so it has to resync. It could be a cable that went bad, and then the cable cannot support it, and it can't make the identification, so it sends you no picture. There's a lot of different options, things that are going on. There are actually devices, boxes to fix that. I thought I brought one here. So little things like this. Oh, by the way, this feature is actually built into a lot of our TV, our displays. We have what's called an EDIT limiter. This is a box that says, "Don't worry about those guys. Look at me. Look at me." And this says, and you can set this to the maximum that both displays can support. And whenever the source goes in, it sees this guy. And because it sees this guy going in and going out, it says, "Oh, you are," and I can set this to be anything I want. I can make it be an LG TV, a Sony TV, whatever I want. I can copy into this box, and this box will always send the right thing. And it will, and these really help with reliability, but they're expensive. But if you have those problems and the customer, it's driving the customer crazy, there are solutions out there by companies like AV Pro Edge, or if you go to Metra, or if you look at HDMI Diagnostics, we have a kind of a limited version of that to help with EDIT problems.
Okay. Let's see. Can you explain how high-res audio travels in HDMI 2.1, which is a great question.
Goes down a different line. If remember I told you there was 19 different wires in HDMI cable, the only ones we've been talking about are 4 of them. There's basically there's about 8 of them. There's still another 11 wires in an HDMI cable, and the audio goes down another one.
Okay.
Which
There's
is
a
why the
lot.
balance don't. Oh, by the way, which is why the balance don't work. If they were just looking at the video side of it and not looking at that other say it's going down cable 17, and they did not plan for something going down cable 17, is why the arc doesn't work on an extender / balance. And this is the last one. We're gonna let you guys go, and we're gonna have to answer the rest via FAQ, or maybe 2 more, Jim.
All right. What type of Cat 6 for HDMI extenders do you recommend?
A good Cat 6 is a good Cat 6. I always say, even if you only need 1, run 2, because Murphy's Law says you run it all the way across the home, and it gets pinched by someone screwing a painting into the wall. So you always run 2 just in case. But most Cat 6 cables, the quality is the quality. I haven't really had a recommendation for that. Normally, if you and this and also if you terminate your own Cat 6 or Cat 5, make sure you test it, because if you mess up a line, you can screw up the whole thing.
And then there are lots of questions about protecting AVRs from voltage spikes or lightning. And I'm not sure if they're talking about power protecting. My guess is there
Yes.
seems to be a lot of chatter about video boards or HDMI jacks going out.
Yeah.
So
I think they are talking about surge protection, because if you think about it, video boards are some of the most sensitive components in a AVR. If you got a big old transformer and transistors, and you get some spikes and some shifts in voltage, that stuff's pretty tough. But when you're looking at small microchips and and tiny little circuits that are used for video switching, those are going to be a little bit more susceptible to burst or spikes. So anytime you can get a good power conditioner or power protection, that is a good thing.
And to the best of my knowledge, there is no HDMI voltage spike protection device available. Nothing that passes HDMI, as far as I know. You know, like how you can plug in your antenna or stuff.
Yeah, not built in, because remember that source voltage protector would have to have be able to identify itself, and you're extending now using 2 cables, and it just adds major problems. So So that, unfortunately, we're going to have to, we went way over. We still have 180 people here, but as you can see, there is a tremendous amount of questions just on half of this particular session. That's why we broke it down into 2 sections. So we will go through and scrub and try to make sure that we answer those questions, the rest of them later. I have a big old shopping list that Jim, Frederick, and Jen and I have to go through. But hopefully you guys got something from this particular session. Again, and like I said, I want to thank you guys again for coming. It seems like we have a very good turnout because you guys are passionate. You got men and women are passionate about what we're talking about here, and that is refreshing to me. And that's why I am more than happy to go 45 minutes over to hang out with people who are really interested in what we're talking about. So tomorrow we're going to get more into the other features of HDMI 2.1 that most people aren't talking about. Variable refresh rate, auto low latency, quick media switching, all this other stuff. And we'll talk about how you can utilize current and upcoming AVRs in real world scenarios. So that will be tomorrow. And I'm sure we will go along there because you guys are going to have even more questions. So anything you want to say, Jim or Frederick, before I let these guys go?
Yes, before we go, thank you very much to elaborate. Indeed, way many more questions left that are unanswered, but we go through. There's always something new popping up as soon as we start a discussion. That's great. We wanted to also thank the partners, and this is coming from Alan, the sales guy from South Asia, thanking all the partners for helping to promote these events. There's going to be many more events, and the more we do different things,
yes,
we will have new topics as well. So
yeah, so eventually we'll do one on maybe surround sound formats and some audio stuff. Considering we're Sound United, let's do some. I'm sure Jim's like, can we talk some audio, please? So
yes. I think 2-channel and AVRs is also a good thing. So 2-channel audio, both brands then on this. There's plenty of things we can talk about. So excellent.
So hopefully between Frederick and Jim and myself, we can build a good relationship between us here in the U.S. and you guys overseas. And so hopefully so maybe we will see each other in person sometime soon. So but anyway, I got to let you guys go. Thank you very much again for your time and coming to my home to talk to me for the last hour and 45 minutes. And we will talk to you guys very, very soon.
Hey, Frederick?
Yes?
Would you take point on getting the HDMI testing instructions out to the SU reps so that they can get them to the attendees?
Absolutely. We'll take care of that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, so goodbye, everyone. We will talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thanks, Phil.
Until tomorrow.
Good job, Phil.
Bye. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.